The clinic wasn't far from my apartment. Just a 15-minute walk past the coffee shop and the row of brick houses I'd passed 100 times before. Normally, I wouldn't have even bothered with a doctor's appointment. A little chest tightness, a bit of fatigue. I told myself it was stress, or maybe the late nights. But my mom insisted, and eventually I gave in. Better safe than sorry, she had said. So there I was, a Thursday afternoon, pushing through the sliding glass doors of a building that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon cleaner, trying not to feel like a kid dragged to the dentist. The waiting room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the TV mounted in the corner, playing a muted news broadcast with captions. A receptionist in pale blue scrubs handed me a clipboard and a pen, her smile rehearsed but polite. I filled out the forms mechanically, circling boxes, scrawling my name, my birth date. My eyes skimmed over questions about allergies and medical history, all of it feeling distant, irrelevant. When they finally called my name, I followed a nurse down a corridor lined with numbered doors. She gestured to an exam room, the kind I'd seen in a dozen movies. Pale walls, laminated posters about nutrition, a cabinet stocked with supplies. She told me the doctor would be in shortly and left me alone with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. I sat on the edge of the padded table, legs dangling, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. The paper crinkled under me with every shift of weight, reminding me of how sterile, how impersonal these places were. I was half considering sneaking out, telling my mom I'd gone and everything was fine, when I heard the click of the door. I glanced up casually, and in that instant, every ounce of casual drained from me. She stepped into the room wearing a white coat, stethoscope around her neck, a clipboard in her hand. But none of that mattered, because the face above that coat wasn't a stranger's. It was my friend's mom. For a second, my brain refused to catch up. I blinked, as if maybe the light was playing tricks, or maybe I was dreaming. But there was no mistaking her. The familiar curve of her smile, the streak of lighter brown in her hair, the calm way she carried herself. I had seen her in kitchens, in backyards at barbecues, waving from doorsteps when I'd picked up her son for school. But never here, never in this context, never in a role that suddenly felt far too close. Her eyes widened just slightly when they landed on me, and for a heartbeat, the room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent light. Then, just as quickly, she masked it, slipping into a professional tone. "Well," she said, her voice even measured. "This is unexpected." I swallowed hard. "Yeah, you could say that." She closed the door softly behind her, setting the clipboard down on the counter. "I didn't realize you were on my schedule today." "I didn't realize you worked here," I admitted, still processing. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Life is full of surprises, isn't it?" She turned back toward the counter, flipping through a few pages of my chart. "So what brings you in?" I explained quickly, glossing over the details, the chest tightness, the fatigue. As I spoke, I tried not to notice the strangeness of it all. She wasn't just my friend's mom anymore. She was Dr. Something, standing there with practiced authority, making notes with her pen. Yet no matter how professional her movements, I couldn't shake the undercurrent of familiarity. The contrast was dizzying. The same woman who had once handed me a glass of lemonade on a hot afternoon now asking pointedly about symptoms, about habits, about stress. "Have you been sleeping well?" she asked, glancing up from her notes. "More or less," I said. "Any unusual diet changes?" "Not really." Her pen scratched against the paper, her expression thoughtful. "And stress?" "School. Work." I hesitated, then shrugged. "Plenty." Her eyes met mine again, and for a moment, the professional distance wavered. There was something in her gaze, recognition, maybe, or a flicker of amusement at the absurdity of it all. Whatever it was, it lingered long enough to make me shift uncomfortably on the table. She must have noticed because she gave a soft laugh, the kind that eased the tension but didn't erase it completely. "Don't look so nervous. It's just me. You've known me for years. That's kind of the problem," I muttered before I could stop myself. Her eyebrows arched slightly, but she didn't press. Instead, she glanced at the chart once more, then set it aside. "All right," she said, her voice taking on a firmer, more clinical tone. "Let's run through a basic exam. Nothing complicated." I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. She reached for her stethoscope, looping it into place with practiced ease. The metallic glint of it caught the light, and I realized suddenly how small the room felt. She stepped closer, the faint scent of her perfume, something floral, understated, cutting through the antiseptic air. "Relax," she said gently, as though reading my thoughts. "This is routine." Routine. The word echoed in my head, though nothing about this felt routine at all. And in that moment, sitting on the edge of the exam table with my friend's mom preparing to examine me, I realized this appointment would not be the forgettable, ordinary checkup I'd expected when I walked through those glass doors. It was only the beginning. She adjusted the stethoscope in her hands with the kind of ease that comes from years of repetition, then gave me a look that was both reassuring and impossible to ignore. "All right," she said, her tone calm, professional. "It's a routine exam. Take off your shirt." The words landed with more weight than they should have. On the surface, they were nothing unusual, the kind of instruction any doctor would give. But the way her eyes lingered on me, the faint pause before she spoke, made something shift in the air. It wasn't just the words, it was how she said them. I hesitated only for a second before pulling my shirt over my head, the paper on the exam table crinkling beneath me as I moved. She didn't look away, though her expression was neutral, carefully measured. Still, something about it felt different, less routine, more aware. "Sit up straight," she instructed, stepping closer. Her voice carried authority, but softer than before, almost careful. She placed the cold diaphragm of the stethoscope against my chest, and I flinched at the sudden chill. "Breathe in," she said. I did, the air filling my lungs unevenly. "And out." Her gaze was steady, fixed on me, but not in the detached way I expected from a doctor. It felt personal, as though she was seeing more than just a patient. She moved the stethoscope to another spot, her hand brushing lightly against my shoulder as she did. Again, in and out. I followed her instructions, but my thoughts were nowhere near calm. The room seemed smaller now, the space between us charged. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing, steady, practiced, and it clashed with the quick rhythm of my own. She leaned slightly closer, listening intently. Her hair, loosely tied back, fell forward just enough that I caught the faint scent of something floral, the same perfume I remembered from her house. For a moment, I wasn't in a sterile clinic. I was back in her kitchen years ago, the smell of fresh cookies in the air, her voice calling us in from the yard. The overlap of memory and present was dizzying. "Your heart beats a little fast," she observed finally, pulling back slightly but not far enough to break the tension. I gave a nervous laugh. Probably just nerves. Her eyes flicked up to mine, and there it was again, that flicker of something that didn't belong to the clinical setting. Recognition, amusement, maybe even curiosity. She shifted, placing the stethoscope against my back this time. "Sit forward," she instructed, her hand pressing lightly between my shoulder blades to guide me. Deep breaths. Slow. I obeyed, the paper beneath me crumpling with every inhale. Each touch, each instruction felt heavier than it should have, as if layered with meaning neither of us wanted to name. After a few moments, she pulled the stethoscope away and looped it back around her neck. She didn't step back immediately. Instead, she rested her hand briefly on my shoulder, her thumb pressing just slightly into the muscle, almost as though testing tension. "You're holding a lot here," she said softly. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. "Maybe." She gave a small smile, one that felt more personal than professional. "Stress will do that, more than people realize." She moved to the counter, jotting down a few notes on her clipboard. For a brief moment, I thought the atmosphere had eased, that maybe I had imagined the undercurrent running through the room. But then she glanced back at me, her pen hovering above the page, and her eyes lingered just a little too long. "So," she said casually, though her tone carried weight, "how have things been outside of this? School, friends, life?" It was such an ordinary question, but in this setting, from her, it felt loaded. I shrugged, trying to keep my voice even. "Busy. Complicated." Her eyes softened. "I can imagine." The silence that followed wasn't clinical. It wasn't even casual. It was something else. Finally, she set the clipboard aside and stepped toward me again. "All right," she said, her tone slipping back into the safe territory of routine. "Let's check a few more things, blood pressure, reflexes. Then we'll be done." But the way her gaze caught mine before she reached for the cuff, the way her smile lingered just a second too long, told me that whatever this was, it wasn't just routine. Not for her. Not for me. And as she wrapped the cuff around my arm, tightening it with efficient movements, I realized that the real exam happening in that room had little to do with my health, and everything to do with the unspoken questions hanging between us. The blood pressure cuff tightened around my arm with a slow squeeze that made my pulse throb harder than usual. She watched the gauge, her expression carefully composed, but her nearness was impossible to ignore. Her hand steadied the cuff against me, fingers pressing lightly, and I found myself holding my breath until she finally loosened it again. "Elevated," she murmured, more to herself than to me. Then, with a faint smile that curved just slightly, she added, "Probably just nerves, right?" I nodded quickly. "Yeah, must be." She studied me for another second before setting the cuff aside. The room felt smaller now, filled with the quiet buzz of fluorescent lights and the unspoken words between us. She made a few notes on her clipboard, her pen tapping against the paper in short bursts, as though her thoughts were moving faster than she wanted to admit. "All right," she said at last, straightening. "Reflexes." She retrieved a small rubber hammer from the drawer, gesturing for me to swing my legs over the side of the exam table. I obeyed, the paper beneath me crinkling loudly in the stillness. She knelt slightly, tapping just below my knee. My leg jerked in response, a reflex as automatic as breathing. But it wasn't the movement that unsettled me. It was the way her eyes flicked up at mine in that instant, the corner of her mouth lifting almost imperceptibly. "Good," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her gaze lingered too long before she moved to the other leg. Each test followed the same rhythm, her instruction, my compliance, the faint spark of something hovering just beneath the surface. Her hand brushing against my wrist as she tested grip strength. The press of her palm against my back as she asked me to sit straighter. The weight of her attention, focused and unblinking, in ways that no routine exam required. When she finally set the hammer aside, she didn't step back immediately. Instead, she leaned slightly against the counter, arms folded, watching me with a look I couldn't place. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't detached either. "You've grown up a lot," she said suddenly. The words caught me off guard. Thanks, I guess?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "No, I mean it. Last time I saw you, you were still in high school." Now, well, you're different. I shifted uneasily on the table, unsure what to say. People change. Some more than others, she replied softly. The silence stretched. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, loud enough that I wondered if she could hear it. She must have sensed it too, because she pushed herself away from the counter and tried to reassemble the clinical barrier between us. All right, she said briskly, though the softness in her eyes betrayed the effort. Let's finish with a few stretches. I want to check for muscle tension, posture issues. Stand here, please. I slid off the table, standing in the center of the room while she guided me through simple movements. Arms raised, bending forward, twisting side to side. Each time, her presence hovered close, her hand occasionally adjusting my shoulder or hip with a touch that lingered just a fraction too long. Good, she murmured, her voice low, when she placed her hand lightly against my back to correct my stance. Better. You hold yourself well. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to nod. The final stretch had me standing with my hands on my hips, rotating my torso slowly. She circled me, observing, her footsteps soft against the linoleum floor. For a moment, I felt like I wasn't just being examined physically. I was being measured in some deeper, unspoken way. When I stopped, she stood directly in front of me, too close. Her eyes met mine, and the silence between us thickened. You're fine, she said at last, though her tone didn't match the words. I exhaled slowly, not realizing I'd been holding my breath. Good to know. But she didn't look away. Her gaze searched mine, steady and unflinching, until it became unbearable. Finally, she turned, walking back to the counter, scribbling something on her chart as though nothing had happened. Still, the air in the room told another story. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, but quieter, more deliberate. You won't mention this to him, will you? I froze. To who? She glanced over her shoulder, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips. To my son, your friend. My mouth went dry. Of course not. Her eyes softened again, and for a moment, there was something almost vulnerable in her expression. Good, she said simply. Then she set the pen down, folding her hands over the clipboard as though the matter was settled. But it wasn't. Not for me. And, judging by the look in her eyes, not for her either. She stood at the counter longer than necessary, rearranging papers, clicking her pen open and shut as though keeping her hands busy might steady whatever had just passed between us. I sat back on the edge of the exam table, still shirtless, still trying to process the weight of her last words. The room felt different now, less like a clinic, more like a secret we were both trapped inside. Finally, she turned, her expression composed again, though not entirely. That's all for today, she said, voice smooth, practiced. Everything looks fine. It was the kind of sentence any patient might hear, the tidy conclusion to an ordinary checkup. But in this room, between us, it carried another meaning. Fine. Normal. Routine. Words that no longer felt true. She handed me back my chart, her fingers brushing mine for the briefest second. I felt it all the way up my arm, and by the flicker in her eyes, I knew she had too. She didn't pull away immediately, just long enough for silence to fill in what words couldn't. I slipped my shirt back on, each motion feeling heavier than it should. She watched quietly, then gathered herself with a small breath. This stays between us, she said softly, not quite a question, not quite a command. Of course, I replied. My voice came out lower than I expected. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer, as though weighing the truth of my promise. Then, with a faint nod, she turned back toward her desk, her hands steadying on the edge as though grounding herself. Good. The atmosphere shifted again, but not back to what it had been. It wasn't clinical detachment, those walls had already cracked. It was something else, something fragile, like two people silently agreeing to leave unspoken what couldn't be taken back. I left the room a few minutes later, the hallway suddenly too bright, too ordinary. Patients sat in chairs, flipping through magazines, unaware that in one of those rooms, the ground had shifted beneath two people who had known each other for years in only one way and suddenly couldn't unsee the other. Walking outside into the sunlight, I felt the cool air hit my skin, and it didn't clear me the way I thought it would. Instead, her voice replayed in my head. It's a routine exam. Take off your shirt. The way she'd said it, the way her eyes had refused to match the words. For the rest of the day, I carried it with me. The faint press of her hand on my back, the brush of her fingers at my wrist, the silence that said more than anything spoken aloud. And beneath it all, the realization that I would never sit across from her son again and see her the same way. She wasn't just his mom anymore. She wasn't just a doctor in a white coat. She was the woman who had looked at me in a way that rewrote the rules of how the world was supposed to work. And no matter how much I told myself it was nothing more than a moment, fleeting, impossible to hold on to, I knew the truth. Some moments don't fade. Some moments divide life into before and after. And this was one of them.